Émilie Du Châtelet's rehabilitation as a philosopher of the Enlightenment has allowed us to highlight different aspects of her thought. Whether we look at her complex theoretical philosophy in the Institution de Physique, her uncompromising hedonism articulated in her Discours sur le bonheur, feminist ideas most clearly expressed in her French adaptation of Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, or her acute analyse raisonnée of the Old and the New Testament in her Examen de la Bible, the diversity and radicality of Émilie Du Châtelet's philosophical legacy cannot be denied. In this paper, in this presentation, I seek to examine and reconstruct a transversal aspect of her philosophy, namely the regulative epistemology she develops throughout her works. In doing so, I aim at showing her original contribution to the series of problems arising within this subfield, which is of great importance within early modern philosophy. Du Châtelet's insistence on defining appropriate epistemic practices, rules to conduct philosophical and scientific inquiries, and her identification of a conducive set of epistemic virtues necessary for this objective point to her overall concern for regulative aspects of epistemology. I believe that Du Châtelet's original conception of hypothesis and the role she assigns to the principles of knowledge are part of a comprehensive approach to regulative epistemology that she puts forth, which is rooted in her conception of reason as a core value of her enlightened philosophy. So, what is regulative epistemology? Analytic and regulative epistemology are two subfields that are often intrinsically linked, despite their different objectives. Whereas the former, analytic epistemology, is engaged in the definition of certain key terms, such as knowledge, rationality, justification, and others, and in producing a theory of knowledge. The latter, regulative epistemology, revolves around producing a normative setting for philosophical and scientific inquiry. Regulative epistemology, explored by early modern philosophers such as Descartes or Locke, among others, is mainly concerned with generating guidance for epistemic practice and has a social and practical dimension, which is recognizable in the way in which it contributes to the transformation of epistemic practices and mentalities. We can also distinguish between a rule-oriented regulative epistemology and a habit-oriented one. The first one is focused on outlining the steps we should take and the rules and procedures for discarding dubious judgments and avoiding falling into error. The second one aims at defining the epistemic habits of mind of the rational person. The emphasis here is on training the mind, that is, on fostering the right intellectual dispositions, rather than providing a strictly defined set of procedural directions for acquiring knowledge. Furthermore, a crucial aspect of regulative epistemology is identifying and working on our epistemic biases. I believe all of these aspects can be found in Du Châtelet's epistemology, for whom it is not just about finding the right scientific method, it's about contributing to the proliferation of the use of reason and the application of philosophy in every aspect of our lives. It is most remarkable that the opening lines of the Institution and the Discours sur le bonheur express a very similar idea. These texts, Du Châtelet confesses, are written for a young readership, her son in the Institution, eager for knowledge and wisdom, to initiate them in the never-ending quest for truth they will hopefully follow throughout their lives. The effort of writing is thus justified as a means to inspire the cultivation of reason in a younger generation, to train their minds and their spirits, to foster in them both curiosity and restraint, and to create the habit of never losing track of the truth, even when, or precisely when, the overwhelming power and vivacity of their passions steer them away from the study of nature and within it of themselves. The mind must remain flexible at all times. This is a quote from the translation of the Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, where Du Châtelet says, "I have observed that the mind rusts more easily than iron, and that it is even more difficult to restore to its first polish. Such sensible reflections do not, however, give the soul back that flexibility it lost, from lack of exercise when one is no longer in the first flush of youth. The fakirs of the East Indies lose the use of their muscles in their arms because those are always in the same position and are not used at all. Thus do we lose our own ideas when we neglect to cultivate them. It is a fire that dies if one does not continually give it the wood needed to maintain it. That's the end of the quote. The mind must be accustomed to thinking autonomously, without blindly and uncritically following external sources of belief. Before giving our assent to a certain judgment about the world, we must apply our reason to assess it. Our actions in general and our scientific pursuits in particular cannot be founded in prejudice and unexamined opinion. Everything is and should be subjected to reason's examination. This means that in science and philosophy, ideas and hypotheses should be judged solely on their merit. The nationality or the gender of their authors are not relevant factors in this assessment. Du Châtelet clearly denounces the perils of discriminating people and their theories based on this type of partisan bias. The production of knowledge being a collective enterprise, it has nothing to gain from the exclusion of certain portions of the population, who, in addition, do not receive the proper means to develop their intellectual faculties and are not encouraged to ask questions about how the world works, significantly impoverishing their quality of life. Purposely obstructing equal access to education and to knowledge hinders the quality of the intellectual pursuit's results. Moreover, l'esprit de parti should have no place in science, and idolatry should be avoided at all costs. There is, however, a fine balance to be achieved here, because a certain amount of admiration and respect for the ideas of predecessors can be healthy, as it leads to disciples developing them or building on them and using them as the foundations for their own contributions to the history of scientific and philosophical progress, as, and I quote Du Châtelet, giants who climb the heavens by riding on each other's shoulders, end of quote. But what does it mean to use reason as guidance for scientific inquiry and for life in general? It means, first and foremost, transforming our natural gifts and abilities into tools that can be employed for this objective. First, not obliterating our passions, but rather cultivating epistemic virtues through them and channeling them into intellectual pursuit. Secondly, instead of disregarding the imagination, using it with moderation to foster the art of invention and create abstractions of the mind, but checking them to ensure they are not mere fictions. Thirdly, instead of eliminating the production of hypotheses from science and philosophy, epistemically validating them and making sure they can be confirmed or refuted by experience. Okay, so how can we distinguish the notion réelle from fictions and chimeras, and true from fictitious statements according to Du Châtelet? The author of the Institution first rejects a key aspect of a Cartesian epistemology, that is, certainty brought about by clear and distinct ideas as the criterion of truth. Among those with opposing views, says Du Châtelet in the Institution, each has this lively and internal sense of what it is they put forward. Thus, no one has to yield, since the evidence is equal on the two sides. So one must substitute demonstrations for the illusions of our imagination and not admit anything as truth except what results incontestably from first principles that no one can call into question, and reject as false all that is contrary to these principles and to the truths that one has established with them, whatever the imagination might say. Determining which of two opposed theses is true and which is false becomes an unattainable task if the justification of these theses resides in the inner feeling and conviction of the one who defends them, as solipsistic subjectivism makes them externally incontestable. It is necessary to arrive at a criterion of truth valid for all, based on indubitable principles and deductive inferences from them, which avoids the danger of this infinite dispute. These principles, which no one can doubt, are for Du Châtelet the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason. The first is useful to determine the possibility or impossibility of beings and their representations, of the notions our mind creates and the statements we put forth about the workings of the world. The principle of contradiction is applied to evaluate necessary truths, although contingent truths also need to abide by the principle, in addition to abiding by the principle of sufficient reason. Something that is contradictory is impossible. Despite the general consensus surrounding this principle, Du Châtelet is well aware that humankind can be led astray from it, particularly when indulging in unexamined illusions, such as fantastic fables, confusing them for true stories. An example is the transfiguration of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. This Babylonian king is transformed into an ox by God as a demonstration of divine power and forced to live as an animal for 7 years. This is what she says in the Examen de la Bible. It is impossible for a man to be changed into an ox. For this to happen, the man would have to be annihilated and the ox created, and the ox would have no more relationship with this man than with any other. It is therefore physically and metaphysically impossible for Nebuchadnezzar to have been changed into an ox, and this is impossible for God himself, for this implies contradiction. However, this is what the text explicitly states. Du Châtelet clarifies here that even God is subjected to this principle. Indeed, the author of the Institution rejects divine voluntarism. God's actions are no exception. They are determined by the principles, which does not compromise their perfection. Indeed, even if the transfiguration were possible in its biblical terms, it would be absurd, unreasonable, given that to fulfill its purpose, that is for God's punishment to be effective, Nebuchadnezzar would need to have kept his mental faculties, his consciousness intact. So this is what she says after that. She says, there is much dispute as to whether Nebuchadnezzar retained his speech and the use of reason during his metamorphosis. Reason, if it could be consulted on such an unreasonable matter, would teach us that he must have retained it, so that his metamorphosis was a punishment for him. For if he had found pleasure in his madness, as most madmen do, he would not have been punished. Okay, so in the second part of her reasoning, Du Châtelet makes use of the principle of sufficient reason, described in the Institution as the cornerstone that divides truth from error. And I quote Du Châtelet, in all cases, we feel that we cannot force our mind to accept something without a sufficient reason. That is to say, without a reason that makes us understand why this thing is what it is, rather than something completely different. So the existence, the properties and the states of a given thing must have rational justification. Accepting that something can exist or can happen without sufficient reason would be admitting that there is no rational order in the world, and that it is governed by chance, and is thus an order without any discernible order. That is a contradiction in its own terms. So here I've included a painting of Nebuchadnezzar, and this is by William Blake. As you can see, he agrees with Du Châtelet on his interpretation because the figure is really human-like. So the action of transforming Nebuchadnezzar into an ox only makes sense in the story as a punishment he must suffer. Therefore, his rational mind, his consciousness must be one and the same all along this transfiguration, before and after it as well, so that he can endure it and learn from it. There has to be a reason for this event to occur the way it does. Otherwise, it would be absurd, which is, it's really actually what Du Châtelet concludes in many of her analysis of the biblical stories of the Examen de la Bible. But we cannot accept that reality is absurd. According to the author of the Institution, there is an intelligent order that governs the harmonious universe created by a supreme architect. Despite the primitive character of the principles that naturally guide us both in scientific pursuit and in our daily actions, the mind, as Du Châtelet puts it, can be forced or led away from them if our attention is not focused on them, if it is redirected somewhere else. Our imagination as a figurative capacity can be employed in the composition of fictitious episodes comprising chimeric beings and random events, without any logical continuity. Fairy tales, myths, madness, and dreams are some of the examples Du Châtelet employs to offer a representation of irrationality, of alternative dimensions in which appearances and reality do not have a substantiated relation. Letting our mind wander and get lost in fictitious orders is what Du Châtelet calls indulging in illusions, redirecting our focus to them in order to escape reality, losing ourselves in a mesmerizing spectacle that captures our attention. It can be a pleasurable experience, but it will only be sustainably pleasurable as long as we are able to voluntarily come out of the illusion at all times, retaining our capability of discerning fiction from reality. The key is thus having the ability to direct and shift focus of our attention, developing strong and virtuous epistemic habits. The institutions do so much more than just offer a definition of the principles of knowledge or a set of rules we must follow to test our ideas and hypotheses. It persistently submits notions on arguments, premises, and conclusions to the test of the principles by asking if they are contradictory and if there is a sufficient reason that explains them. It is a repetitive exercise the reader must go through both throughout the Institution and the Examen de la Bible, and that it instills in them the habit of asking these questions, of drawing their attention to coherence, justification, and the rational articulation of the world. Scientific hypotheses have to be rigorously tested, not only to check if they abide by the principles, but also to make sure that they can be refuted when confronted with experience. Their explanatory and predictive power must be tested by observations and experiments. No amount of those will ever be enough to fully confirm the truth of a given hypothesis, but only one is necessary to refute it. At most, scientific hypotheses can be granted a certain degree of probability, taking into account the outcomes of these experiences. Nevertheless, Du Châtelet warns scientists not to delude oneself and others about hypotheses, so de ne pas se faire illusion à soi-même et aux autres sur les hypothèses, and not to impose them on others when they have not undergone the appropriate tests. The risk, the temptation of falling into illusions will always be latent, but it can be averted by thoroughly testing these hypotheses, just as it is important to examine our beliefs in order to not be subjected to prejudice. Challenging scientific hypotheses and empirically testing them is what establishes a fair ground for their competition. According to the author of the Institution, we must not fall into the two most noticeable extremes in this regard, personified by Cartesians on one hand and by Newtonians on the other. Cartesians have a taste for fictions and fail to produce testable hypotheses. And she says in the Institution, this is how philosophy books, which should be a compilation of truths, were filled with fables and reveries. So that's a quote. Newtonians, on the contrary, wish to ban all hypotheses, describing them as philosophy's plague or poison, which evinces a certain epistemological rigidity. Du Châtelet offers an example of this epistemological dispute at the beginning of the Institution, where she says, it would be just unfair on the part of the Cartesians to refuse to admit attraction as a hypothesis, as it is unreasonable for a few Newtonians to want to make it an inherent property of matter. It must be admitted that a few among them have gone too far in this, and it is with some reason that they are reproached for resembling a man at the opera whose bad eyesight prevents him from seeing the ropes that make the flights of actors possible, and who, for example, seeing Bellerophon, suspended in the air, said, Bellerophon is suspended in the air because he's pulled or he's attracted equally on all sides from the stage wings. Or in order to decide that the effects the Newtonians attribute to attraction are not produced by impulsion, it would be necessary to know all the ways in which it can be used, but we are still very far from knowing that. So Du Châtelet offers the image of a theatrical representation of Bellerophon and Pegasus fighting the monster Chimera, metaphorically directing our attention to the symbolism of the Chimera's defeat. So, an image of that mythical moment. Bellerophon riding Pegasus is elevated and attacks the monster from above. In her analogy, there are some Newtonian spectators in the audience who fail to see the wires that make this character fly in the theater, right? We have to assume we are in the theater, and thus assume this phenomenon is explained by attraction, that is, by action at a distance, prematurely disregarding other possible mechanisms, impulse, which is in this case clearly at work. Even though Du Châtelet here is mostly targeting Newtonians, Cartesians are criticized too. If both sides accepted attraction as a hypothesis, then it would be possible to have an open, objective competition of scientific hypotheses. And as we know, Newton would definitely win, but okay, that's not the point. So noticing the mechanisms that create the mesmerizing trick helps preserve the illusion of Bellerophon's ride on a flying horse. Du Châtelet evokes this theatrical scenario again in the Discours sur le bonheur and describes this illusion as an enjoyable enchantment, one of the most powerful sources of pleasure that exists. So, okay, truly, she says in the Discours sur le bonheur, what pleasure would one have at any other spectacle where all is illusion, if one was not able to abandon oneself to it? We cannot give ourselves illusions any more than we can give ourselves tastes or passions. But we can keep the illusions that we have. We can seek not to destroy them. We can choose not to go behind the set, to not see the wheels by which the flights are made or which make the flight, and other machines of theatrical productions. So again, shifting our attention from the story and its dramatic representation to the mechanisms behind the scenes will most likely break the illusion. Here we have two competing pleasures. On one hand, the pleasure of abstractly and temporarily withdrawing ourselves from reality or from contemplation of reality. On the other, the pleasure of knowledge, contemplating one of the many gears of a rational, organized, harmonious universe. The latter seems to be more sober, but can also contribute to the development of other pleasures as new theories may arise and new mechanisms may be created due to its inspiration and due to the questions we must consider to solve the puzzle. To conclude, we are fragile, imperfect beings whose experience of the world is limited and confusing. To uncover the secrets of the universe, we must rely on each other. Thus, the collective dimension of scientific inquiry cannot be overlooked. Du Châtelet explains that the start of any scientific inquiry will almost always be imperfect, tentative, and that progress in science is achieved by learning from the mistakes others have made. In sum, we must always keep on trying because even straying from the right path can be useful in scientific pursuit of knowledge. So she says in the Institution, it is absolutely necessary in order to preserve oneself from error, to verify one's ideas, to demonstrate their reality, and not to admit any as incontestable unless confirmed by experiment or by demonstration, which includes nothing false or chimerical. So we must turn our attention away from fables, fictions, and chimeras if and when we are trying to find an explanation for natural phenomena. We will have other opportunities to enjoy them in life, but only if we can trust ourselves as epistemic subjects, well trained in the identification of truth and in the hedonistic mechanisms that draw us towards them. Du Châtelet's regulative epistemology is part of her broad enlightened philosophical viewpoint and her exaltation of reason, not only in science, but more generally in all domains of life. I've highlighted some of the key rule-based and habit-based aspects of it in order to show that it is conceived within an ethical and political background conducive to progress and the amelioration of individuals and society, I would say as well. So we have seen that the profile of the scientist, of the philosopher that Du Châtelet creates is quite morally demanding, as they need to practice the following epistemic virtues: intellectual curiosity and critical capacity to go beyond what is given or assumed, modesty to acknowledge the limits of their own faculties as finite subjects and to understand that they are a part of an intellectual community without which scientific progress would not be possible, which also entails an ethical commitment to philosophically nurture younger generations, caution and restraint to be always alert and revise their beliefs, potential prejudices, testing them through the application of the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason, and contrasting them with experience as much as possible, a sense of epistemic and hermeneutic justice to avoid reproducing exclusionary mechanisms and assessing ideas for their own merits, intellectual honesty to not disguise false or deceptive ideas as truthful for selfish purposes, a taste for study, knowledge, and the contemplation of the beauty of a harmonious universe, resilience to not be discouraged by bad news whenever they incur in an error, tenacity, since the mind needs to be fed and trained relentlessly, or persistence, maybe. Du Châtelet believes, and I quote, "We all have a sufficient share of intelligence to examine things that others want to oblige us to believe." That's the end of the quote. And we must therefore never shy away from the challenge. Thank you.